One of the major impacts of the coronavirus epidemic was how quickly companies had to transition to remote working. However, with many people working from home in less secure environments, this introduced a whole range of vulnerabilities. As such, today on LokadTV, we're delighted to be joined by Professor Richard Wilding, who's going to discuss with us the topic of cyber risk in supply chains. So Richard, thanks very much for joining us live from the UK today. Perhaps just to start off, you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the work you do at Cranfield.
Okay, so my background, actually, I started off my career in industry and I accidentally fell into academia quite a few years ago now, and I've never managed to escape. But basically, I've had a career really looking at disruptions in supply chains, and this is going back to the early 90s. I mean, of course, the types of things we were experiencing then were very, very different. In the 2000s, of course, we had things like 9/11, we've had ash clouds, we've had fuel crises, there's been foot and mouth disease, all sorts of things which actually impact on supply chain risk and supply chain resilience. And I actually became probably one of the first professors of supply chain risk management in the world. But actually that title has now evolved, and I'm actually Professor of Supply Chain Strategy at Cranfield. My goal is knowledge into action. So what I actually love doing is taking this knowledge and creating action in industry. I'm immediate past chairman of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport in the UK, which covers everything, the movement of goods and people and all their associated supply chains. So that covers an awful lot. And really if you like, I often say my strap line is very much around challenging and inspiring supply chain leaders to innovate. So I do hope that our listeners today and our watchers today are going to be able to take some things away and think, we'll take that idea and we will innovate, taking ideas which are new to you and creating economic, social or environmental value. And that's really what Cranfield is all about. It's really taking supply chain, taking sort of knowledge to supply chain leaders, enabling them to innovate and actually then be able to create value in the supply chains, the businesses that they're actually working in. So that's really, what I'm all about, as it were.
Okay, brilliant introduction. I definitely think that idea of innovating is something we'd agree with here on LokadTV. Joannes, our topic today is all about kind of cyber risk and its impact upon our supply chains. What's your kind of initial overview?
Cyber risk is one of those things that is super, I would say, counterintuitive in practice. It's very difficult, for example, if you want to detect, I would say, security problems with software, most of the usual testing methodologies do not work. Most of the, I would say, of the usual development practice fail at addressing those concerns. It's in a way, it's a sort of topic that is very elusive, and what I would say has increasingly piqued my interest over the last decade is that most of, I would say, the direction taken by enterprise software in general over the last decades tend to, I would say, increase what is technically known as the surface attack area of those software. So you have softwares that are more exposed to attacks, especially when you move toward, I would say, the cloud. Cloud environments are more secure, but you have a lot more entry points for your software. And also, whenever you have a web app, you have, I would say, entire classes of risks that are very difficult to mitigate or to prevent by design in terms of potential security problems.
Okay, Joannes sort of mentioned there these sort of testing methodologies that don't work so well. Richard, if we look at things maybe from a perspective of a supply chain, what is it about a supply chain that makes it quite so difficult to kind of secure?
And from a supply chain perspective, what we want things to be relatively open. We want to be able to connect with our suppliers, connect with our customers, and so on and so forth. But that actually does create multiple entry points. And what we found is that often attacks are occurring on supply. If I want to shut a business down, a denial of service attack on a website, yep, that's devastating. But actually, if you start thinking through the devastation that could be caused to your business through, for example, disrupting a warehouse management system or autonomous vehicles or things like that, that could be far more devastating for a business in terms of its capability to be able to carry on and resurrect itself moving forward. So and what we're finding is some of the actual attacks which are occurring at the moment are occurring through, it could be a supplier portal, for example, so that people are gaining access on data or being able to supply information to, a large customer, as it were. But that creates an entry point. If somebody could do something as simple as a phishing attack, and that can create issues. So these are some of the things. So you can see that there's multiple exposure. And this has been something which I've been talking about now for, probably 18 months now, because we've seen a big rise in, if you like, cyber attacks on supply chains, as it were. Now, just one thing which is really interesting is whose job is it to stop this happening? The problem is if you go to the supply chain teams, they go, oh, well, that's IT. If you go to the IT teams, they'll say, well, actually, supply chain's got to be, it's everybody's job. So we've got to make sure that there's awareness across everybody to stop these types of things going. So that is critical, educating the business and making sure they're aware of these challenges.
Yeah, Richard kind of mentioned there that our supply chains are definitely becoming more connected. Like if you look at any multinational, they're spreading their systems kind of all over the world nowadays. Would you say that increased connectivity is a real kind of weakness?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I meant when I say increased surface attack area. The more things are exposed to any third parties, because on the internet, you don't connect to a person. So if you say you have a web portal, you just mean that you have a piece of software that interact over the port 80 through HTTP. So it can be, on the other side, it's always machine. Then the machine can be operated by a human. It can be operated by a human that happen to be the employee that you believe that this person is, or it can be operated by anything, a bot or whatever. So indeed, that's the things. But where I would slightly digress and where I think, diverge, I would say, in terms of security, maybe with the interpretation, is that I believe that overall education of users in general is not a way to solve those problems of security. That's why it's very, very deeply counterintuitive. Because it has to be kind of, I would say, a pitfall of security. You really need to have a specific, a specific approach of correctness by design. You cannot expect people not to click on, I would say, attachment or whatever. If you expect that people will stick to the rule for something where they are just one click away from disaster, they will do it. So, for example, one of the simple attacks is called the USB key on the parking lot attack. You just drop with malware a USB key on the parking lot, and you write on top of the USB key, you write Bitcoin stash. And you will and you can be sure that there will be someone that will actually try the key connected to their computer. So if you rely on the fact that people are supposed to be educated, I mean, they are human, even if they are pretty smart, they can have, lack of sleep. Sometimes they have a lapse of judgment just happen. So if you rely on that, on people to be like smart and alert and educated, it kind of doesn't work. And it's very funny because when you see how security is done in companies, let's say Google, they take the kind of opposite stance, and a stance that has been more, applied in other areas like the nuclear industry, where you assume, on the contrary, that people are going to be dumb. When you think they are going to do something super dumb, you think, can they do even something that will be even worse than that? But there are plenty of other ideas that are similar, which are pretty much by design.
Okay, yeah, Joannes kind of mentioned that idea of correctness by design there, Richard. So what are kind of the methods that we can introduce to ensure that kind of our systems are very much safe?
Well, I think it is an interesting thing, and I think we've got to have the correctness by design. There's no doubt about that. But if you're looking at, the old 80-20 rule of what are the causes of a lot of the issues, sadly, it is people. And I mean, it is interesting to know that Google Australia, they got hacked, right, by some hacktivists, just to show they could do it. And the way that they accessed that was actually through the building control thing for Google's nice new building in Australia. It got hacked. And if you look at some of the real big, the big things which have really disrupted businesses, if you look at, for example, Target, who got done in the States, and that's still rumbling on now with all sorts of class actions and everything else. That was quite interesting. 40 million payment card credentials and 70 million customer records were just harvested. And the way that actually occurred was that was actually through the heating and ventilation air control system. A supplier was targeted with phishing emails. They then were able to get into that part of the business. Then they just went around and sat around harvesting stuff, found out the point of sale network, and then just sat there taking the stuff in. And I think that this is really important because so far it's cost them, believe it or not, 162 million. Right, so that is one particular disruption which has occurred. But I think that the key thing here is being able to actually make people, aware of these things, aware of their responsibilities. But then you've got the design side of things as well. The problem is you need some level of openness, right? So if I just think about my laptop, the university can lock it down so I can't do anything with it, and it's not much fun. And we had this a few years ago. It was like, oh, this is corporate, nobody can go on LinkedIn, nobody can go on YouTube, nobody can go on this, nobody can go on that, right? But the problem is going back to innovation is taking ideas which are new to you and creating value. If all of a sudden you lock down your systems because these could potentially enable people to access things that they shouldn't, or it weakens our infrastructure and everything else, that can actually have another effect. So with the big, let's have a social media blackout within our company, what that has actually resulted in is a innovation blackout as well, you could argue, because now a lot of the innovation and the good ideas are being shared effectively through these channels. So you've got to be particularly careful about this. And I think it's one of these things of getting a balance between accessibility and also security, but making sure by design, if things do go wrong, you detect it quickly.
Okay. Did you want to jump in there, Joannes?
Yes, I mean, just to give you, when I was saying, for example, it's counterintuitive, I think the whole idea of locking down, I would say, is a perfect example of that. If you have like a super tight security for the laptops where the company can only, you can only install the software that has been approved and you can only visit the website that have been approved. And so then what happens in practice? People bring their own devices. They buy their own laptops, and so while in theory you were thinking that you were creating security, you're not, just because people are just going to react and do something else on the side. And same thing for passwords, for example. There have been like studies even published by, for example, the NSA in the US that showed that password rotations are harmful. If you rotate passwords frequently, what people do is that they put post-it notes in their desk with the password of the week. And so you end up with entire offices where the password of everybody is on everybody's front desk on a post-it. So that's why I say it's very counterintuitive. And it's not just a balance, it's that indeed, frequently you can actually push people to do things that are even less secure. And again, I think the nuclear industry has a lot of good example of that, where if you burden people with too much protective equipment, at some point during the summer it's just too hot, so they get rid of everything just because they can't even bear the heat of all the stuff that they have to carry. And thus they end up having no protective equipment at all, which is very, very dumb. So, so that's why you need to think, that's why security is so counterintuitive, is that you need to think of how humans will react, and it's like, I would say, completely recursive, and it's feedback loop. When you think about it, there are some data that you should not collect for any duration of time, maybe 1 week, and get rid of it.
Okay. I think the interesting thing about Target, of course, was they weren't storing the data. That was just going through their systems. If you're doing a credit card transaction, it has to go through the internet to the bank. If you can sit there tapping that feed which is effectively what was going on, then you can do this type of things. But I think it is really important. If you think about GDPR and data protection now, it's only keep what is really needed. What's the point of having all this stash of data? And some companies now saying with artificial intelligence, they believe that, I'll keep all this data because I might be able to do something useful with it in the future. Well, that's a bit like me keeping every single email I've ever written in my life. It's, will I ever do anything useful with it in the future? Right? So we have to sort of think through that. I think one of the things as well, I love this little quote when I'm talking to people about passwords. It's passwords are like underwear. You don't want to let people see it, change it often, and you should not share it with strangers. But at the same time, you've got to make sure that you're able to remember these things as well, which is why you need other approaches with this.
Okay. Richard, let's talk a little bit maybe about the current situation. We're seeing more and more people kind of working from home because of coronavirus. Presumably this has introduced a lot more kind of risk. So what can a company, maybe somebody watching this, do in order to protect themselves?
Well, I would recommend we have things. I think the thing is, when you're working at home, it's about, you could argue that to some degree it's more secure, because if there's passwords left all over my desk, which they're not, I can tell you. But if they are, then there is less people who are going to be actually moving through. So there are some elements that you could argue with people remote working, this actually could be slightly more secure. But at the same time, we've now got everybody's own devices being used, which is the point which was made earlier, and we need to be able to deal with that as well. And it's also what you've got to recognize now is I'm using my own personal routers, internet connection, Wi-Fi network, and everything else. So then how secure is that? So I think that what companies need to do is they need to very much start actually basically educating their employees to think about working at home. And really, as I mentioned, there are things like Cyber Essentials, which are really useful. They're out there. There's a lot of stuff like that out there, which we can start just educating people in terms of what they're doing.
Yeah. Joannes, what's your advice maybe to somebody watching this? From what you've experienced at Lokad, how do you protect a company from staff such as me maybe making bad decisions?
I would repeat, I really don't believe in this sort of things through the education routes, or maybe, a very specific way. Just to give you the sort of ideas of what are the sort of emerging threats that we see. Nowadays, you have, I would say, tons of counterfeits on Amazon, and even for things as basic as USB cables. And nowadays, you can have a USB cable that is actually transmitting malware to your computer. You would think, oh, it's just a cable. It's just a cable. Why is a cable? But the reality is that with the progress of computing, you can have like a microcomputer inside a cable. And by the way, that's the sort of things that happen just to do, adapters and these sort of things. So bottom line, you can have in a cable, something that is as powerful as a computer from 20 years ago, but it's just a cable, and it looks like a cable. And it can even have a brand that you trust, but what you're buying is actually a counterfeit, and Amazon has tons of problems with that. So again, I would say the sort of problems that are, the problems in terms of IT security are so rampant, so diverse, that I'm very, very skeptical on the idea that you could train people to do anything that will make any difference. But remote has one positive advantage, which I believe is absolutely not the one that people think of, is that it makes remote work more acceptable. And what, in my experience, has been the most positive way to improve IT security was actually using white hats, hackers who literally propose their service remotely to just say, I'm going to hack into your company, and you know what, let's agree on a price if I can find, some holes in your stuff. And that's where security is like so weird, is that when you, I mean, as you know, business practitioners, I expect people to behave in certain ways. You know, it's just that they will not, you know, make absolutely outrageous lies to your face. But in terms of cyber attacks, it's very much possible. I mean, literally, you can have somebody who calls and they pretend to be Dell support, and it's completely made up.
But yeah, my phone line, I get about 3 calls a day at home, basically offering those services. No, I think it is interesting. I mean, I've, you know, in my role on boards of directors, we have employed such people. Generally, they have done time. So, you know, they've got the badges to show they're good at this. They've been hackers who have been put in prison. But, you know, now they're legitimate. They're going straight and they're, you know, working, you know, with organizations. But it is very important to do that, and that needs to be done in a reasonably regular way, because if you like, the methods of attack are changing. But it's also a matter of people understanding what you need to do when you're actually going through this. And also now, of course, there is more sophisticated software which can pick up on some of these things. You know, if files are being changed just even slightly, or being, you know, bits of code being rewritten, it will start creating alerts on that. So there is now, if you like, software approaches. We have to think through the hardware approach, because, yeah, as you say, you know, USB sticks coming from here, there, and everywhere. You know, as part of the Cranfield organization, we have one of our campus which works with the military, and USB sticks are, you know, not allowed in that particular environment. You know, it's simple. So we were putting in some sort of guidelines like that, but in other areas, it's that sort of trade-off of, actually, this is convenient, but what we don't want is a mega attack on this. So how can we limit things within our systems and sort of firewall what's actually going on, so that there are, you know, things are done?
Okay. Richard, if we start sort of wrapping things up now as a kind of a final word, we focused a lot maybe today on some of the negatives and maybe how easy it could be to kind of attack us, but also maybe let's finish on maybe a positive point that sort of cybersecurity has improved an awful amount over the last couple of decades. And what do you kind of see for the future? Will that continue to improve, and will we be safer than ever at one day?
Well, I think that it's a running battle. What we have to realize is that cybersecurity is a running battle, and it is continuing to improve. So, I mean, if you just take one example, if you think about your average Windows laptop, if you bought it, say, 5-6 years ago, it would come with absolutely nothing, and you'd have to basically go and buy yourself a, you know, some clever virus protection subscription and everything else. Now, if you buy a Windows laptop, it comes with Windows 10, which actually has, you know, and I'm sure some people are going to very much argue about this, but it actually has a sort of half decent virus protection on. You know, it's free. Hey, it's free, and it does a bit of the job, you know, and some of those things can be a little bit more secure. So we're starting to see that this is seen as part of it. It used to be, of course, that Macs were seen as totally secure items, but what we're now finding is of course that you know, people are able to target that and so on and so forth. So this is a continual game which is moving on, but in a positive way. We're never going to get rid of this completely, but let's just hope that the good guys can keep ahead with this. And if people, you know, I still go back to totally agree with the perspective that, hey, we can't do anything about it, but we've got to create awareness across everybody to actually just have this in the back of their mind. If they know that, hey, USB sticks can create havoc for you, even a cable can create havoc for you, because this is the nature of what's going on, that is awareness, and they might think twice before doing some of these things. But at the same time, you then need on your systems something which will actually detect that and stop that malware sort of being deployed.
Okay, brilliant. We're going to have to wrap it up there, but thanks both for your time. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Thanks for watching.